Welcome back to another episode of The Political Life. Today we have a new guest, Rich Gold. Rich is the leader of the Public Policy and Regulation Group at Holland Knight. One of the largest and most successful public policy groups in D.C. Rich has been on before.
Once or twice.
Once or twice. And, we have all been reading about what is going on in Washington in regards to the debt ceiling. And I thought I could read about it, or I could call Rich, and I decided to call Rich and record it. And also I got Rich to agree that he is going to host this podcast in a couple of weeks, most likely, schedules permitting. And so Rich will have to let us know. He doesn't have to let us know today. Let us know what he is going to do. Obviously, things could change. We may not have an agreement, in which case the wheels will come off, and we'll be dealing with that. But anyways, Rich, always great to talk to you and great to see you.
Well, thanks for having me, Jim. I appreciate it. Good to be here.
Yeah. And things at first, things with the family are good?
Everybody's good. Everything going about as well as could be expected. So just
good.
Glad to be here and be able to talk to your listeners today.
Good. And I'm hoping we get through this without someone knocking on your door. I can see your door in the background. One person has already walked up and I waved them off. And luckily you can't see them. So your back is turned to them. And how are things at Holland Knight? You guys are busier than ever.
We are. Everything going good here. And if we can just get through the next, 10 days before X Day, I think we'll be downhill from there.
So really, I really just have one question. So give us the update. What is going on? What are the different parties looking for? And what are the likely scenarios or outcomes?
So no organized group of people would create a process like this, right? Like, it's hard not to look at this from like a stand-up comedy perspective. Okay, the world's leading democracy puts in place a requirement that every so often you're going to basically you're going to do a political cage match on the budget where you could blow up the entire economy every few years just for the heck of it. And the reason I say that is because no one else does this. Only the United States puts itself in this position. And it's never an issue when Republicans have everything or Democrats have everything. It's only an issue when Republicans have one of the houses and Democrats have the presidency. So you would think by this point, somewhere along the way, all of these harebrained ideas of 14th Amendment, printing the $1 trillion coin, that's my favorite idea. I like the $1 trillion coin. All of these things would have been flushed out of the system and tried, or at least legally analyzed at some point, so that again we wouldn't have to do this crazy stuff. So basically, we're 2/3 of the way out towards the cliff in the end scene of Thelma and Louise, and so far no one is stepping on the brakes. And I would say I've been doing this for a while now, 35 years or so. I know I don't look that old, but
You do not. Oh, I'm sorry. Rich, 35. Oh my God. You must have started this in your teenage years.
When I was a teenager. Exactly.
Wow.
No, when I was a teenager, I was doing bad things on the streets of New York. But this time feels a little different. And it feels a little different for the following reasons. As opposed to last time we went through this in 2011, as divided as we were back then, and you can kind of think of the Obama years and some of the difficulties in the Obama years from a societal perspective, we are way more divided now as a culture, right? Red states, blue states, you know, those states passing very different laws on the same subjects, right? So the general view of who we are as a society and where we need to go is fundamentally more divided than we were a decade ago. And, you know, I say this a lot, but it's true. All we are in Washington is a reflection of you all out there in the real world. So you can point and laugh at Washington, but you're just looking in the mirror. It's not like the parties are not representing their districts or their states. And fundamentally, because we as a culture have really two largely different views of where the country should go, with Republicans and Democrats, and then the more important group, the independents in the middle, who are probably, to be honest with you, the majority, or close to a majority of the voting population, who are pox on both those houses. I don't like what either says, you know, most of the time. And for the most part, those independents end up voting for or voting against somebody and voting for the lesser of two evils in many instances from their perspective. So if you take all that as sort of undergirding, where we stand right now is really with the speaker and the president trying to reassure the public in the first instance that progress is being made, and their respective bases, the Democratic base and Republican base, that they are not selling them out while making progress. And that therein is the problem. The middle ground between what Republicans want here and what Democrats want here really raises the question of whether you have concentric circles at all, whether there's any overlap to reach a deal. So just to refresh everyone's recollection, Republicans started out by saying they wanted to freeze spending at the fiscal 22 level, which would be a huge cut from current year's funding. On top of that, remember, because of inflation for next year, we just to stay even, we need about $90 billion over current year's funding. So you're talking about a $200 billion cut to go to fiscal 22, which is roughly 18% of the federal budget, domestic, discretionary, and defense. Both parties have taken out of the debate Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other mandatory spending. Keep in mind, again, that appropriated spending, which is what we're therefore talking about here, is really a small percentage, basically a third, maybe a little bit more of the total federal budget, with mandatory spending making up the difference. So you're in a space where we are trying to make all these cuts amounting to a significant reduction in federal spending to meet Republican demands from a very small portion of the overall budget. And then Republicans are suggesting that it come from an even smaller portion of the budget. So they want increases in spending for defense, veterans affairs, and other national security initiatives, and therefore offsetting cuts from the domestic discretionary budget that goes to everything from your national parks to the Army Corps of Engineers for flood control, to the Environmental Protection Agency, to you name it. So that's sort of the Republican ground on which they are currently standing. President and Democrats are in a space where they, in the first instance, offered up to freeze the current level of spending at the fiscal year 2023 level. Remember, what that really is a $90 billion cut, right? Because we're not going to give any money for increases from inflation. So while it's called a freeze, it's actually a real cut in the ability of the government to do its work. And the president, dealing with the other items that Republicans have requested, has agreed to some form of additional work requirements on SNAP benefits and TANF as well. And then some form of permitting reform, which would probably just be an opening offer to a more detailed permitting reform bill to happen in the fall. So we would probably speed up NEPA reviews for major projects, but not do sort of a full reform of what it would take to get energy projects going. That will wait for the fall. And then probably some clawback of unspent COVID funds, which we've heard big ranges on that money, but generally I'm hearing between 30 and 50 billion, which is real money, but not a lot of money. So the question is, given how far apart the parties are on the budget, roughly 150, $200 billion maybe, in terms of actual limits on spending for the next 2 fiscal years, how do they bridge that gap? And that's really where the problem is at the end of the day. You have Speaker McCarthy on the one hand, who obviously had difficulty getting elected in January and had to go through a number of rounds to be elected Speaker. And sort of the far right of the Republican Party, who have made clear that the Speaker needs a win here. And that has really put the Speaker in these negotiations in a corner, and in terms of having limited authority to negotiate anything much beyond the cuts that were included in the House bill. Now, there's been some sense that the Speaker is willing to take some smaller degree of cuts in the fiscal year 23 level. But keep in mind, again, that we're talking about $90 billion in inflation already. Even if you add another 50 to 70 to $80 billion in cuts on top of that, 150 to 170 billion in cuts, and then only apply that to domestic discretionary, not defense spending, you're talking about 20, 25% cuts in domestic discretionary spending. We've never done that in the history of the country. And there's no way the president will do that. Because if he did, he wouldn't get a single Democratic vote in the House or the Senate. And even if the Speaker achieves that kind of cut, he will not get every Republican vote in the House. He probably is going to lose somewhere between 50, 75, it could be as large as 100 Republican votes in the House on this package. And it's going to be very difficult to lure any Democrats with those kind of cuts. And honestly, the reason for that on both sides is both parties see this vote as problematic from the perspective of potentially drawing a primary opponent for a lot of members. So for Republicans, if they vote for a package that doesn't get as much as party leaders, specifically former President Trump, have said is needed, those members could be vulnerable to a primary on the Republican side of the aisle. And if Democrats vote for a spending cuts package, where the cuts are too large, they could be challenged by progressives who say, you cut some of the most important programs in government, you should have stood up for your constituents, and you didn't do that here. So this is probably the most or one of the most consequential votes we'll see in this Congress. And members are very well aware of that fact. And thus, the degree of difficulty in sticking the landing here and figuring out what's the right level of budget cuts, where is the middle here, and you can see them struggling with it. Now, will they get there at the end of the day? Of course, because Armageddon is the only other option, and no one ever chooses that, right? Will they get there before June 1st? Maybe, maybe not. What happens if they don't? If they don't get there by June 1st, we can either do some kind of short-term extension, and Republicans have made clear they're opposed to that. But theoretically, you could do a short-term extension and Republicans would ask for something in return, right? A down payment of some sort. Or, God forbid, I'm not suggesting this is going to happen, but you could breach the debt limit. There are, 40% of the current Congress wasn't here in 2011, maybe more, maybe 50% now. And they don't necessarily buy that dog and cats will rain from the sky and everything will catch fire on June 1st if they don't act. And as we all learned lessons when we were young, sometimes you actually have to stick your hand in the fire to figure out you're going to get burned. And I think there's a 10% chance this is one of those moments. Now, it's funny, I was given a speech last Friday on this, and I basically said, gee, I thought the odds of default had gone down from 40 to 50% to 10%. And I was speaking to a lot of folks from the financial services industry, and they all looked like they were going to have a heart attack. They're like, 10%? That's totally unacceptable. What's the matter with you people in Washington? Well, see my prior comments, right? We just reflect you guys.
10% was too high.
That's the current state of play. If I'm a betting man, then my sense is that they will get a deal, but not till late this week or early next week. And even that's not a good thing, and let me explain why. In 2011, we cut a deal just a few days out from the debt limit, and it did impact us. We have been paying more on the government's debt. We've had to pay higher interest on the government's debt since then. And that's just real money taxpayers are paying. And in part related to that, we were downgraded by one of the financial rating services in terms of the quality of our debt, which resulted in that increase in the amount of interest we pay for borrowing this money. So there are real world impacts to these things happening, and we're not just playing with artificial deadlines and things that only matter to the government. At the end of the day, we are playing with the fiscal solvency of the U.S. government and the ability of all of us to function in the economy well. And we seem to collectively continue to put ourselves in this situation almost like we're risk junkies, right? Let's see if we can bridge the gap this time. And we really need to find a better solution to instilling fiscal discipline than having this argument every decade or so. But we haven't done that yet. So these discussions change really a few times a day at this point. And we could be in a situation tomorrow or the next day where a deal is emerging. And we could be in a situation tomorrow or the next day where the market drops 700 or 800 points and people, all of a sudden find religion and start getting down to brass tacks on a deal. But we're not there yet. There's reason for confidence that they'll get it done, but there's also reason to be concerned.
Okay. Well, that is a great overview. I have a number of questions. And just for our listeners, we are recording this Tuesday, May 23rd at 1 o'clock. So when you hear this, that is when Rich is making these statements. Rich, you mentioned that this can often happen when we have a Democratic president and a Republican Congress. Did you mean that a divided government can also happen with a Republican president and a Democratic Congress?
No, a Democratic. So this fundamentally reflects the shift of the Republican Party to the right over the last 30 years, right? So in certainly the 70s and 80s, early 90s, there was a sense among Republicans that they were for limited government, but they saw a purpose to many government programs. Again, think of George H.W. Bush, even Ronald Reagan. We weren't arguing over fundamentally a lot of the types of things we're arguing over now. There was a shift really from 1994 when Speaker Gingrich came into power on where, and really we've taken additional steps to the right in 2010 with the Tea Party coming in with Obama in office, and then again when Trump came in 2017, where really there's very little the Republican Party sees as worthwhile in domestic discretionary spending. And when I don't mean to paint with a broad brush, it's certainly not every Republican, but the ruling class on Capitol Hill responding to the more conservative elements of the Republican base basically take the position of, with the exception of the Department of Defense, the government is a lot of wasted money, and we would be better off if it was much smaller, as small as you can get it. And we don't need government mandates. We don't need government programs. People should be able to survive on their own without handouts from the government. Democrats obviously view government as playing an integral part in people's lives, and lots of government programs are needed on a daily basis in order to support our standard of living and prevent income inequality and other issues from getting worse than they even are right now. And so Democrats sort of, even when there's a Republican president, don't view the debt limit as something that they're going to take advantage of or hold hostage or whatever term you want to use. They tend to get it done relatively easily when they have the House and or the Senate with a Republican president. That was certainly the case the last couple of times we've seen that combination, where you really have these situations arise, as was the case in 2011, is when one or both of the bodies are held by Republicans and you have a Democratic president.
And when you say that Kevin McCarthy may lose up to 100 members, is that because it's not enough cuts, not enough? Okay.
Correct. And also I think, never forget the power of one here, right? I think most people view former President Trump as probably opposing whatever deal comes out of this. And for a lot of House members, if you're in a, bright red Republican district and Trump is opposing the deal, you are in a very difficult situation. If you vote for that deal, that is opening the door to a primary for a lot of those members.
You mentioned some work requirements. That seems to be, even cracking that door open seems to be a pretty significant concession.
Some added work requirements. So there are already work requirements for TANF, adding work requirements there. And I should say, I don't think I made enough of this in my comments. There are a lot of Democrats who are very concerned about this. These are, we call this spending entitlement spending. It is mandatory spending to provide the safety net in society so that people who need and don't have enough money to buy food so that people who need money from the government to live can do so. And adding additional work requirements over, for instance, what Bill Clinton negotiated on welfare reform with Republicans in the 90s, especially in a situation where, the unemployment rate is already very, very low, and we're not seeing excess labor out there. It could really put people in a difficult situation, especially if we follow, as some people are predicting, with at least a mild recession, if not something more serious, over the next 3 to 4 quarters. You're putting on additional work requirements at a time where people will probably have trouble finding jobs and the economy is turning down. That is a recipe for, additional problems with homelessness, additional problems with, children not having what they need on a daily basis to eat and go to school well fed, all those types of things. So I think there's a lot of concern about that on the Democratic side of the aisle. But keep in mind, we haven't struck a deal on any of these things yet. And until we solve the budget caps issue of how much we're going to spend over the next 2 years, we don't even get to that issue. Now, they have had discussions. I think all the issues have been surfaced at this point. There's, I think, a general sense of where both parties want to go on those issues. And I'm told that the other issues, permitting reform, work requirements, and clawback of COVID money, will not hold up a deal. But, keep in mind, Democrat and Republican House members are going to look at the whole package and evaluate it from the perspective of what does it mean for them and their district, and can they vote for it? And striking that balance is a very tricky thing right now, given how divided society is.
And the biggest hurdle in striking a deal is the cuts or the freeze at the 2022 level or the 2023 level. And I was going to also say, agreeing to freeze it at the current levels without the inflation $90 billion increase, that's significant.
Yeah, and keep in mind, doing that while you increase, I'm not saying we're going to end up doing this, but if you take the Republican offer at face value, if you're going to increase defense and veteran spending, other national security accounts, while you're cutting significantly on the domestic discretionary side, that is really creating a huge imbalance in the federal budget that favors, defense contractors, the world's largest bureaucracy in the Pentagon, over, the public benefit from all the things we talked about before, national parks to worker safety protection to EPA to flood control, all these things that sort of keep things humming. So those would be somewhat unimaginable cuts to do. And that's really why we are where we are, 10 days out.
Are the increases to the military budget, is it just your normal increase, or is it specific programs, the Ukraine war, China?
Right now we're really dealing with, sort of the broad brush of numbers. So we're not in the appropriations bills at this point where you would be micro-targeting those increases to specific accounts. So we can't really answer that question. Right now, what they're talking about is a general increase to the DoD budget, not only to cover cost increases from inflation, but money on top of that. So you would be cutting the domestic discretionary side of the budget, not compensating for inflation this year, and cutting in addition to that, while you were adding to the DoD budget, covering inflation and then providing additional money for new expenditures.
Is there any, and hope or thought about reducing the budget deficit going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think both parties are focused on that. Somewhat the irony here, as we went through in the beginning, the appropriated funding in the budget is only a relatively small percentage of the budget. And it is actually not the part of the budget that is creating the big budget deficit right now, right? So the budget deficit that we're seeing, which has shrunk over the last couple of years, was in the first instance carried through from the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act tax cut that was passed in the Trump administration and reduced federal revenues significantly. So, Congress, there is no history of Congress giving tax cuts and then cutting spending to meet the budget that reducing, the tax revenue allows you to meet. So we have no history of doing that. The current deficits arise really out of the Reagan administration in some ways, historically, where we had huge tax cuts and didn't pay for them at the time. And that goes to the issue that Republicans have traditionally taken the position that tax cuts will juice the economy, which will increase tax revenues and therefore pay for themselves. You all know who P.T. Barnum is and should understand when you're hearing a P.T. Barnum sales pitch, that's what that is. It didn't work. It doesn't work. We are not getting more revenue from tax cuts. Corporations just give that money back to stockholders, which just makes transfer of, wealth to the richest class even worse than it would otherwise be. But I think we're in a space here where we're dealing with the reality we're dealing with. Republicans have taken any tax increases off the table in this discussion and are just focused on the spending side of the ledger. So we are where we are.
Well, Rich, this has been, that was just a wonderful explanation. I really appreciate you coming on during your lunch hour there. And so have you decided on your special guest in a couple of weeks? Do you want to give the audience a teaser, or it's unknown? You're going to leave it open?
If I can convince him and, get on his dance card early enough, which is always a thing. I would love to have my brother from another mother, Marty Gold, come on.
Gold Brothers. That would be a great episode.
Because Marty, let me put it this way. On this stuff, right? This is my baseball cards, right? I've memorized everything I need to memorize about all the stats here. On this stuff, there aren't too many people who I can sit around with and talk and learn a lot from. And Marty Gold is one of those guys. So I think he would be fun to have on. Plus, he's sort of my Ed McMahon, right? Like he's the straight guy. And that just allows me to riff a little bit and be a little bit more funny than I would otherwise be.
All right. Well, we will wait and pay attention and see if you actually get Marty Gold on of Capitol Council. They have been on before, but unfortunately I was on with them. So we didn't get to have the true Gold Brothers episode, which hopefully will happen in a couple weeks. We will get this out as soon as possible. Rich Gold from Holland Knight, thank you so much for coming on. And for our listeners out there, remember you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and you can sign up for our email at thepoliticallife.net. And we hope you all have a great week.